There is one unbreakable rule of warfare: an army cannot outrun its supply line. It is the law of military gravity. But in late August 1944, General George S. Patton didn't just break that rule, he shattered it. He created a crisis that threatened the entire Allied invasion. The official reason was a simple fuel shortage. But the real story, hidden in the declassified records of a mission called the Red Ball Express, reveals a single, overlooked clue to a far more dangerous failure, one that nearly got Patton's best divisions destroyed. The war, for most people back home, was a thing of maps. Clean lines on paper, confident arrows showing the Allied advance slicing through France in the late summer of 1944. It was a war of statistics, of communiques read over the radio in calm, reassuring tones. It was a war that made sense. But war on the ground, war as it is actually lived, is never about clean lines. It's about mud and fear and the maddening, beautiful, terrifying chaos of the unknown. And in the last week of August, somewhere in a dusty French farmyard east of Chartres, a young quartermaster lieutenant named Marcus Thorne was discovering that the map was a liar. Thorne was a man who believed, with an almost religious fervor, in the power of numbers. He was an accountant from Cleveland, drafted and sent to logistics school, where he'd learned that an army doesn't march on its stomach. It marches on statistics. Gallons of fuel per mile, pounds of C rations per man, crates of .30 caliber ammunition per rifle company. It was all a grand, complex, but ultimately predictable equation. You plug in the variables distance, speed, resistance, and the answer tells you how many trucks you need to send where. For weeks, since the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows, the equation had worked. It was tidy. It was sane. But that afternoon, under the shade of a shell-scarred oak tree, sanity was bleeding out of his ledgers. He held a clipboard in one hand, a pencil in the other, and a cold knot of dread tightening in his gut. The numbers staring back at him weren't just wrong, they were impossible. They were a defiance of logic, a violation of the physics of war as he had been taught it. The plan, the big-picture plan cooked up by the generals in their serene English manners, had General George S. Patton's Third Army advancing at a brisk, but manageable, 30 miles a day. Thorne's job was to keep the tip of that spear sharp, to push the lifeblood of the advance, the fuel, the bullets, the medicine right up to the teeth of the fighting. According to the formula, Patton's armored columns should have been somewhere near Troyes. They should have consumed, to the gallon, the 400,000 gallons of gasoline allocated to them for this phase of the operation. Instead, the frantic, static-laced reports crackling over the radio from the forward units were painting a picture of sheer insanity. They weren't near Troyes. They were screaming past it. They were approaching the goddamn Meuse River, over 100 miles ahead of schedule. They weren't advancing 30 miles a day, they were devouring 70, 80. And they were drinking fuel not like an army, but like a firestorm drinks air. The consumption reports on Thorne's clipboard looked like a madman's fantasy. A single Sherman tank division was reporting fuel usage that, by his calculations, was enough to have driven them halfway to Berlin. He ran the numbers again and again. He checked his math, his smooth accountant's handwriting becoming a frantic scrawl. It couldn't be right. An entire army couldn't just run away from its own supply line. That was suicide. It was like a deep-sea diver cutting his own air hose because he was impatient to reach the bottom. It defied every rule, every single doctrine. Imagine you're him. Imagine spending your whole life believing that 2 + 2 = 4. And then one day, the world screams at you, with the roar of 1,000 tank engines, that the answer is now 27. That was the feeling in that French farmyard. It was a fundamental breakdown of reality. He looked up from his clipboard at the endless line of dusty GMC trucks waiting for orders, their drivers chain-smoking and staring east, into the haze where the Third Army had vanished. They were the artery, but the heart was pumping too fast. It was going to burst. Just then, a corporal sprinted from the radio tent, his face pale. "Sir, message from Combat Command B, 4th Armored. It's Colonel Abrams." Thorne felt his blood run cold. Creighton Abrams, the fiercest, most aggressive combat commander in the whole damn army. "What is it, Corporal?" The corporal swallowed hard, reading from a hastily scribbled note. Message reads, "We've got Germans surrendering to our cooks. We're holding the bridges over the Meuse at Commercy, but we have no fuel. Repeat, we are bone dry. If we don't get gasoline in 12 hours, we'll have to abandon the armor and walk home. That's the end of the message, sir. Thorne stared at the corporal, then back at his clipboard, then at the map spread over the hood of his Jeep. The Meuse River. Commercy. He found the town with a shaking finger. It was a tiny dot, impossibly far to the east. It wasn't just ahead of schedule. It was on a completely different page of the calendar. The official reports, the ones sitting on the desks in Supreme Headquarters, said Patton was still days away from that river. But he wasn't. He was there. He was stranded. And the tidy, elegant mathematics of the entire Allied invasion of Europe had just catastrophically shattered against a single, brutal fact. How do you supply an army that is moving faster than information itself? How do you fuel a phantom that has driven clean off the edge of the map? Back at Supreme Headquarters, in the stately, manicured grounds of Versailles, the war was still a thing of serene geometry. Here, hundreds of miles from the mud and the cordite, the conflict was managed not by men in foxholes, but by calm, starched officers moving wooden blocks across colossal maps. The air didn't smell of diesel fumes, and death it smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and the faint, arrogant scent of absolute certainty. The frantic reports from Patton's Third Army were arriving, of course, but they were viewed less as an accurate portrait of reality and more as a symptom of a well-known condition, George S. Patton's incurable case of tactical exuberance. The official explanation was simple, logical, and dangerously wrong. It was born from the central dogma of the Allied plan, a strategy of overwhelming, methodical power. Think of it like a glacier. The plan was for the Allied armies to advance on a broad front, an unstoppable wall of ice grinding steadily towards Germany, crushing everything in its path. It was safe. It was systematic. It guaranteed that no single part of the front could be cut off and destroyed. Patton, in their view, wasn't acting like a glacier. He was acting like a lightning bolt, a brilliant, unpredictable, and utterly unsustainable phenomenon. The consensus in the high-ceilinged rooms of SHAF was that Patton had simply gotten carried away. Intoxicated by the thrill of the chase, he had recklessly pushed his spearhead far beyond the reach of its logistical lifeline. The fuel crisis, therefore, wasn't a strategic emergency, it was a self-inflicted wound. The solution was textbook order Patton to halt, consolidate his gains, and allow the supply echelons, the plodding, reliable tortoise to his theatrical hare, to catch up. The problem, as they saw it, wasn't the war. The problem was Patton. A British logistics officer, a brigadier with a tidy mustache and a deep suspicion of American impulsiveness, summed it up over a cup of tea. The man thinks he can run on glory alone, he murmured to a colleague, gesturing to a pin on the map marking the Third Army's supposed position. Someone needs to remind him that tanks, unfortunately, do not. It was a neat, tidy box in which to place the anomaly. But the fog of war, the true antagonist of any campaign, doesn't respect maps. It seeps under the doors of command tents and whispers uncomfortable truths. And that afternoon, the first of those whispers arrived not in a request for fuel, but in a G2 intelligence summary that landed on a junior analyst's desk with a soft, unassuming thud. It was a report from the POW processing centers far to the rear, back in Normandy. It was a simple tally, and the numbers on the page were an impossibility. The analyst, a young captain from Yale who was a wizard with statistics, stared at the teletype flimsy. He was expecting the prisoner count from Patton's sector to be in the hundreds, perhaps a few thousand. That's what you get when you're fighting a disciplined, retreating enemy. You capture stragglers, small units that get cut off. But the number on the paper was 30,000. 30,000 men in the last 72 hours. He assumed it was a typo. A clerk must have added an extra zero. Such things happened. He sent a query back down the line, a routine request for confirmation. An hour later, the reply came back, stark and without comment, figures confirmed. Repeat, 30,000. More arriving hourly. We have run out of barbed wire. The captain felt a prickle of sweat on his neck. He stood up and walked to the grand map. He looked at the neat line of the German front as it was drawn, a solid, unbroken thing. He then looked at the POW report in his hand. The two pieces of information could not both be true. A professional army conducting a fighting withdrawal does not hemorrhage 30,000 men in 3 days. A mob does. A disintegrating, Panicked, shattered rabble does. He walked the report over to his superior, a full colonel. "Sir, I think we have a problem with the map." The colonel glanced at the numbers, his brow furrowed. "A typo, Captain." "They've confirmed it, sir," the captain said, his voice quiet but firm. "The German 7th Army, the entire force that was supposed to be holding the line in front of Patton. I don't think it's retreating. I think it has ceased to exist." In that moment, the comfortable, official explanation that this was all just Patton being Patton evaporated. The tidy box was shattered. This wasn't a logistical problem caused by an overeager American general. This was a strategic earthquake. The enemy hadn't just been pushed back, he had been broken. An open door had swung wide, leading straight into the heart of Germany. And Patton's tanks, the only force on the entire continent in a position to charge through that door, were sitting silent and helpless on the banks of the Meuse, their fuel tanks reading empty. The revelation in the map room at Versailles didn't trigger cheers of victory. It triggered a cold wave of panic. The 30,000 prisoners weren't a trophy, they were a testament to an opportunity so vast, so war-altering, that the thought of letting it slip away was physically nauseating. The comfortable glacier strategy, the broad front advance, was suddenly exposed for what it was: a safe, plotting plan for a war that no longer existed. The war of attrition was over. A war of exploitation was begging to be fought, and the Allies were about to fail the test. To understand the scale of this crisis, you have to understand the anatomy of a military advance. Think of an army as a living organism. The combat troops, the tanks, the infantry are the muscles and teeth. But they are useless without a circulatory system. The circulatory system is logistics. It's the endless chain of trucks, trains, and ships that pumps the vital blood of the campaign: fuel, ammunition, food, and replacements from the heart in the rear all the way to the fighting fringe. If that circulation is cut, even for a moment, the muscle dies. It seizes up, withers, and becomes nothing more than a static, vulnerable target. Patton's Third Army had just outrun its own pulse. It had performed a miracle of combat, but in doing so, had created a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. The heart of the Allied supply system was still beating back on the beaches of Normandy and the recently captured port of Cherbourg. The distance from Cherbourg to Patton's stranded tanks on the Meuse was over 400 miles. 400 miles of shattered French roads, demolished bridges, and countryside still crawling with bypassed pockets of German resistance. There were no functioning railways. The pipelines were still being built, inching their way across the landscape. The entire circulatory system of the most powerful army ever assembled was a network of broken capillaries. And the clock was ticking with a brutal, unforgiving rhythm. A shattered army doesn't stay shattered forever. The Germans, for all their faults, were masters of the desperate improvisation. They would scrape together reserves, rush and panzer divisions from other fronts, and plug the gap. Intelligence estimated the Allies had a window, a tiny, fleeting window of perhaps 72 hours to exploit this catastrophic German collapse before the door slammed shut. 72 hours to get hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline and thousands of tons of ammunition across 400 miles of chaos. If they failed, Patton's army wouldn't just be stalled. It would be a sitting duck, an isolated island of armor ripe for a devastating counterattack. The greatest victory of the campaign could flip, in a matter of days, into the most humiliating defeat. This was the terrible new equation that landed on the desk of Colonel Loren Little Albert, the head of the Motor Transport Brigade. The problem was no longer about moving supplies, it was about defying the laws of time and distance. The existing truck companies, running their normal routes, could never do it. They were already stretched to the breaking point. It would be like trying to put out a skyscraper fire with a garden hose. What was needed was something new, something radical, desperate, and on a scale never before conceived. In a smoky, frantic meeting of logistics commanders that went late into the night of August 25th, the idea began to take shape. It wasn't a plan born of careful study, but one sketched on a napkin out of sheer, white-knuckled necessity. They would strip every non-essential unit of its transport. They would pull drivers from artillery battalions, from engineering companies, from bakeries and graves registration units. They would create a dedicated, non-stop, 24-hour-a-day loop of trucks running from the beaches to the front. A one-way road for outgoing supplies, a parallel one-way road for returning empties. No stops, no speed limits, no sleep. They needed a name for it, something that conveyed urgency and priority. In the American railway system, a ball train was a fast freight, marked with a red ball for priority clearance. Someone in the room history has forgotten who said it aloud. We'll call it the Red Ball Express. The name stuck, but it was more than a name. It was a declaration of war against reality itself. It was a promise to create, out of thin air, the largest, most relentless trucking operation in the history of warfare. They had 72 hours to turn a desperate scrawl on a napkin into a functioning artery that could pump the lifeblood of an army across a continent. Failure wasn't an option. It was a certainty if they didn't try. And so, the order went out, crackling over radios and clattering on teletype machines across northern France. The Red Ball Express is a go. All available 2.5-ton trucks, all available drivers. Report immediately to staging areas near St. Lo. The mission: fuel the Third Army. The deadline now. The birth of the Red Ball Express was not a grand ceremony of polished boots and inspiring speeches. It was an explosion of organized chaos in the churned-up fields and clogged crossroads of Normandy. Imagine the biggest, most frantic warehouse you've ever seen. Then multiply it by 1,000 and stretch it for 50 miles. That was the staging area near St. Lo. It was a sea of olive-drab steel under a perpetual haze of dust and exhaust fumes. Thousands of GMC Jimmy trucks, the rugged, 2.5-ton workhorses of the Allied Army, were being marshaled into endless columns, their engines growling with a deep, impatient thunder. And into this maelstrom of machinery came the men. They were not elite paratroopers or hardened rangers. The vast majority of the drivers assigned to this desperate, unprecedented mission, nearly 75% of them, were African American soldiers. They were men from the Quartermaster Corps, the Transportation Corps, the engineering battalions. In the segregated Army of 1944, these were the service and supply units, the jobs deemed unsuitable for white soldiers. They were the men who loaded the ships, dug the ditches, and paved the roads. They were the invisible gears of the great war machine, unseen and unsung, relegated to the rear by the bitter logic of institutional prejudice. For a private named James Jackson, who a week ago was told he couldn't sit in the same mess tent as white soldiers from Alabama, the red ball painted on his bumper felt like a revolution. For the first time, he wasn't just in the Army, he was the Army. Suddenly, these men were being told the fate of the entire war in Europe rested squarely on their shoulders. A sergeant, his voice hoarse from shouting, screamed at a line of new drivers. Your job is to follow the truck in front of you, and don't stop for anything short of God Almighty Himself telling you to. And I expect you to argue with Him first. You understand me, soldiers? The first clue that this operation was different, that the old rules had been thrown out the window, was the red ball itself. Officers with stencils and buckets of crimson paint were moving down the lines of trucks, slapping a simple, stark red circle onto the bumpers and canvas covers. It was a brand, a mark of supreme priority. That red circle was a passport that superseded all other authority on the road. It meant you didn't stop for MPs. You didn't stop for checkpoints. You blew through towns and intersections, your horn blaring, because whatever you were carrying was more important than anything else happening in France. For men who had spent their entire lives, both civilian and military, being told to wait, to step aside, to give way, it was a profound and dizzying shift in the natural order of things. The second clue was the cargo. 5-gallon jerrycans of gasoline. Tens of thousands of them, stacked high in the truck beds. They called them GI gas. The cans were flimsy, the seals were often faulty, and they reeked of volatile fumes. The drivers quickly learned this was the most terrifying cargo imaginable. A single stray tracer round, a lit cigarette flicked from a passing jeep, even a backfire from your own engine could turn your truck and everything in it into a 5,000-pound fireball. They were driving mobile bombs, chained together in a 500-mile-long fuse. A sense of raw, unadulterated purpose began to spread through the staging areas. This wasn't just another supply run. This was an assault. The target wasn't a pillbox or a town, it was a number. For 100,000 gallons. The daily consumption of Patton's Ghost Army. The first convoys rolled out on the afternoon of August 25th, a great green serpent slithering out of Normandy into the heart of France. The plan, so hastily conceived, was beautifully simple in its brutality. Two main routes were designated: a northern loop for the outbound journey, a southern loop for the return. They were marked with signs, with red balls painted on barns and telephone poles. These roads were now the exclusive property of the express. Nothing else was allowed to move on them. The feeling in those first few hours was one of pure, unbridled momentum. The lead trucks, guided by military police on motorcycles, roared through the shell-pocked town of St. Lo, then past the hedgerow country where the breakout had been so bitterly won. They rumbled through village after village where French civilians, just weeks removed from Nazi occupation, lined the roads, waving, cheering, and throwing flowers and apples. For these drivers, who had been treated as second-class citizens by their own army, to be hailed as liberators was a powerful, intoxicating drug. The war, for the first time, felt truly theirs. They were no longer the gears, they were the engine. The mystery of Patton's impossible advance had been met with an equally impossible solution. And for a moment, it felt like it was going to work. The initial optimism of the Red Ball Express, that heady rush of purpose and cheering civilians, lasted for approximately 100 miles. Then, it slammed head-on into the unforgiving reality of what the German army had left in its wake. The neat lines on the map in the planning room, the two clean loops designated as the Red Ball Highway, were a cartographer's fantasy. On the ground, they were a broken, bleeding mess. The hope that this would be a simple, high-speed delivery service dissolved into a brutal, grinding battle against the landscape itself. The first great enemy was the road. The French highway system, once the pride of Europe, had been systematically pulverized. Allied bombers had spent months savaging it to prevent the Germans from reinforcing Normandy. Now, that strategic success had become a logistical curse. Pavement gave way to cratered dirt tracks. Roads narrowed to single lanes, choked with the burned-out husks of German panzers and horse-drawn carts, the dead animals still bloating in the summer heat. Every few miles, a demolished bridge would span a river, its back broken, forcing the entire convoy to lurch down a hastily bulldozed bypass, hub-deep in mud. This is where the enemy's genius, the cold, calculating mind of the retreating Wehrmacht, revealed itself. This wasn't random destruction. It was methodical. They hadn't just blown the bridges, they had blown them in the most difficult-to-repair places, at the widest parts of the river, in the deepest ravines. They had mined the shoulders of the main roads, turning every breakdown into a potential death sentence. They hadn't just abandoned their tanks, they'd left them as roadblocks at critical choke points, forcing the American engineers to work frantically with bulldozers and welding torches to clear a path, all while the Red Ball trucks stacked up behind them for miles, their engines idling, burning the very fuel they were meant to deliver. The simple, promising plan of a nonstop, high-speed loop began to hemorrhage time. A driver, a corporal named Willie Davis, had been on the road for 18 hours straight. His eyes were burning from dust and lack of sleep. His hands were cramped into claws around the vibrating steering wheel. His convoy had averaged less than 10 miles an hour since leaving Paris. Up ahead, he could see the telltale sign of another stop, a frantic waving of flashlights in the pre-dawn gloom. He eased his foot off the accelerator, the truck groaning in protest. When he finally got to the bottleneck, he saw the problem. A narrow stone bridge, barely wide enough for one truck, was sagging in the middle. A team of engineers was working desperately beneath it, shoring it up with massive timbers, their faces illuminated by the headlights of the waiting column. An MP walked down the line, his face a mask of exhaustion. "Hold it up, drivers. Bridge is about to go. Engineers, say one truck at a time. 5 miles an hour. No braking on the span. Got it. One truck at a time." Davis looked in his rearview mirror. The headlights of the convoy stretched back over the horizon, a river of light that had now been dammed. He did the math in his head. 200 trucks in his convoy alone. At one truck every minute. That was over 3 hours just to cross this one miserable, half-collapsed bridge. And how many more bridges like this were there between here and the Meuse? It was here that the drivers realized the truth. They weren't just truck drivers. They were combat engineers. They were mechanics. They were pioneers hacking a road through a wilderness of destruction. They were not just the hunters of a logistical solution, they were being hunted by the ghost of the German army, whose meticulous destruction reached out from the past to strangle their efforts. The initial theory that this was a straightforward problem of distance and speed had collapsed. This was a war of attrition, not against a human enemy, but against the very infrastructure of France. The Red Ball Express wasn't a race. It was a siege, and they were losing. The Red Ball Express was bleeding out on the broken roads of France. Convoys that were supposed to complete a full circuit in under 3 days were taking 5, sometimes 6. Trucks were breaking down at a catastrophic rate, their springs shattered by potholes, their transmissions burned out from the constant shifting in the stop-and-go traffic. Drivers, pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, were falling asleep at the wheel, running their precious cargo into ditches or, worse, into the truck in front of them. The great artery, so brilliantly conceived, was clotting. Just as the situation seemed utterly hopeless, the breakthrough came. And it came not from a brilliant general with a new master plan, but from a handful of anonymous NCOs and grease-stained mechanics in a muddy field designated as an ordnance repair depot. It was a place called Villacoublay, a bombed-out French airfield southwest of Paris that had been turned into a makeshift automotive hospital. It was a hellscape of spare parts, shattered engines, and exhausted men. The problem they faced was simple and insurmountable. They didn't have the parts to fix the broken trucks. A GMC truck with a blown head gasket, a simple repair that would take a few hours in a proper garage, was now effectively a total loss. The official supply chain for spare parts was even slower and more chaotic than the Red Ball itself. For every 10 trucks that went out, 3 or 4 weren't coming back. The Express was consuming itself. But in the chaos of Villacoublay, a new, unsanctioned, and technically illegal system was born. It was a system of battlefield salvage, or, to put it more bluntly, industrial-scale cannibalism. It started with a master sergeant named Eugene M. Montgomery, a grizzled veteran mechanic from Detroit who viewed a deadline truck not as a failure, but as a collection of organ donors. He looked out at the acres of broken-down vehicles, the ones with shattered axles but perfect engines, the ones with burned-out clutches but pristine transmissions, and saw the solution. "We ain't getting the parts from the rear," he grunted to his crew, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "So we're going to make our own damn parts depot right here." He organized his mechanics into teams of automotive vultures. They would swarm over a newly arrived, disabled truck. A triage officer would declare it unsalvageable, and then the men would descend with wrenches and cutting torches. In a matter of hours, they could strip a 10-ton truck down to its bare frame. The good engine would be pulled and set aside. The intact transmission would be cataloged. The usable tires, axles, carburetors, and radiators were all harvested and organized in sprawling, muddy fields, creating a Frankenstein's junkyard of life-saving components. This ad hoc system was then supercharged by an even more audacious innovation, born from the drivers themselves. A new kind of communication began to flow back down the line. A driver heading back to Normandy with an empty truck would pass a disabled convoy. He'd stop and talk to the stranded driver. "What do you need?" "A fuel pump for a 42 Jimmy." The returning driver would become a mobile messenger. He'd get back to the staging areas, find a mechanic, and pass on the request. Or, even more directly, he'd get to Villacoublay, find Montgomery's sprawling junkyard, and a salvaged fuel pump would be put on the next truck heading east. They called it the Grapevine. It was an organic, peer-to-peer logistics network, running completely parallel to the official chain of command. It had no paperwork, no requisitions, no bureaucracy. It was powered by shared desperation and a common goal. This informal system allowed the mechanics to anticipate needs, to preposition commonly needed parts at makeshift repair points along the route. Special wrecker teams were created, mobile surgical units armed with salvaged parts, that would patrol the Red Ball Highway, fixing trucks right where they broke down, getting them back into the fight in hours instead of weeks. The impact was immediate and dramatic. The number of trucks being lost each day began to plummet. Convoys that had been stranded for days were suddenly resurrected and sent on their way. The clots in the artery were being busted, one by one, not by an order from Supreme Headquarters, but by the ingenuity of the men on the ground. They had discovered that the only way to supply an army that had driven off the map was to create a supply system that operated completely off the books. The chaos of the battlefield had been met not with more order, but with a better, more effective form of chaos. The Red Ball Express was flowing again. with the lifeblood of the Red Ball flowing again. Thanks to the illicit genius of the salvage crews, a new and horrifying picture of the front was finally coming into focus. The raw data being ferried back by the returning drivers wasn't just about broken fuel pumps and blown tires. It was about what they were seeing at the end of the line. The reports they gave during their brief stops for coffee and fuel were raw, unfiltered, and deeply disturbing. They painted a portrait of the Third Army that bore no resemblance to the triumphant spearhead being lauded in the press releases. The drivers spoke of delivering fuel not to orderly depots behind the lines, but directly to the tanks themselves, right on the battlefield. They described pulling their fume-leaking trucks up to Shermans that were in the middle of active firefights, their crews screaming for gas, while German machine gun rounds stitched patterns across the canvas covers. They talked about seeing Patton's legendary tankers, the so-called Iron Men, looking gaunt and hollow-eyed, their uniforms in tatters, rationing cigarettes and scavenging food from abandoned German stores. The most unnerving reports concerned the ammunition. The Red Ball was hauling mountains of it, but according to the drivers, it was the wrong kind. They were delivering millions of rounds of .30 caliber rifle ammunition and 105mm shells for light artillery. But what the tankers on the Meuse were screaming for was 75mm and 76mm high-velocity, armor-piercing shells for their Shermans. They were facing the terrifying new German Panther and Tiger tanks, whose thick frontal armor could shrug off standard rounds like pebbles. Without the right ammunition, Patton's armored divisions were becoming little more than a collection of very large, very vulnerable steel coffins. One young driver, a private first class with an eidetic memory for numbers, was brought before a logistics officer on the ground, a Major Will Call O'Connell, who embodied the concerns of many who had begun collecting these anecdotal reports. The PFC, his face smudged with a week's worth of road grime, spoke with a quiet, certain horror. "Sir, we dropped off 1,000 crates of .30 cal at Chartres. They're using it to build walls. They got no room to store it. But up at Commercy, I saw a tank commander, a captain, trading his pistol and a bottle of cognac to an infantry sergeant for just 5 rounds of AP. 5 rounds. That's all the infantry platoon had. Sir, they're fighting tigers with a sidearm and a bottle of booze." This was the uncomfortable truth. The Red Ball Express had succeeded in its primary mission. It was getting volume to the front. The sheer tonnage was staggering, but it was failing in its most critical task, getting the right volume. The system was a blunt instrument, a fire hose spraying everything forward in the desperate hope that some of it would be what was needed. The logistics planners, sitting hundreds of miles in the rear, were still supplying the army that existed on their planning documents a balanced force of infantry and armor. They were shipping supplies based on formulas and projections, a cold, academic exercise in tonnage per man. But Patton's army, the one that actually existed on the banks of the Meuse, wasn't a balanced force anymore. It was a pure armored predator that had shed its infantry support, that had outrun its artillery, and was now engaged in a life-or-death struggle against superior enemy armor. It didn't need 10,000 rifles, it needed 10,000 armor-piercing shells. Major O'Connell compiled these battlefield reports into a single, explosive memo. Among the frantic reports was a detailed, meticulously argued plea from a quartermaster lieutenant named Marcus Thorne, the same accountant from Cleveland who had first seen the ghost in the machine. Thorne's numbers proved, beyond doubt, that the army was screaming for armor-piercing shells while being buried in rifle rounds. O'Connell attached Thorne's analysis to his own growing file of anecdotal evidence, creating a powerful combination of hard data and human testimony. He bypassed the normal chain of command, knowing it would be filtered and diluted. He sent his report directly to the G4, the chief logistics officer for the entire theater. The memo was a bombshell. It argued that the Red Ball's manifest was dangerously, perhaps fatally, flawed. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that if the priority wasn't immediately shifted from general supplies to high-velocity tank ammunition, the 4th Armored Division would likely be annihilated within a week. He wasn't just reporting a problem, he was accusing his own command of catastrophic incompetence, of fighting a war on paper while losing the real one on the ground. He had just lit a fuse on a bomb that pointed directly at his own headquarters. Major O'Connell's memo did not land in the halls of SHEF at Versailles like a thunderclap. It landed like a lead balloon in a vat of molasses. The official reaction was not alarm, but a quiet, deeply entrenched institutional resistance. The system, the vast bureaucratic organism responsible for supplying the entire Allied expeditionary force, did not like being told it was wrong, especially by a junior officer compiling what amounted to battlefield gossip from exhausted truck drivers. The first response was dismissal. The G4 section, staffed by older, career officers, reviewed O'Connell's urgent plea and saw it not as a vital warning from the front, but as a symptom of hysteria. The logic of the rear echelon was impregnable. The manifests were correct because the formulas were correct. The Third Army was receiving its regulation allotment of all classes of supply, calculated with painstaking precision based on the established TOE, the table of organization and equipment. To them, the idea that an entire army could so radically change its needs on the fly was not just improbable, it was improper. Armies were supposed to be predictable, manageable things. Patton's force was behaving like a rogue element, and O'Connell's report was seen as an endorsement of that indiscipline. A teletype clattered back to O'Connell's makeshift headquarters. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic stonewalling. Be advised, it read, supply priorities are set at theater level based on strategic, not tactical, considerations. Confirm your inventories and resubmit requests through proper channels. It was a polite, official way of telling him to shut up and color inside the lines. The system was pushing back. But O'Connell, emboldened by the stories he was hearing, refused to back down. He began using the Red Ball's own informal grapevine to fight his battle. He started sending his own men-trusted NCOs up the line with the convoys. Their mission was not to haul cargo, but to conduct reconnaissance. They were to get a direct, unfiltered accounting of the ammunition crisis from the combat units themselves. They returned with harrowing, handwritten validation. Signed statements from company commanders, lists of tank serial numbers that were combat ineffective due to lack of AP rounds. They brought back a single, captured German 88mm shell as a visceral piece of evidence. Its sleek, deadly profile a silent testament to what the Shermans were facing. Armed with this new, undeniable proof, O'Connell escalated. He went outside the logistics channel entirely and sent his report to the G2, the intelligence section. He framed the issue not as a supply problem, but as a critical intelligence failure. His argument was sharp and terrifying. High command was making strategic decisions based on a completely false understanding of the Third Army's combat capability. They were moving wooden blocks on a map that, in reality, represented hollowed-out formations on the verge of collapse. This move was the equivalent of pulling the pin on a grenade in the middle of a staff meeting. It was an act of career suicide. The response from high command was swift and brutal. Major O'Connell was formally reprimanded for a breach of protocol and for communicating outside his chain of command. A telex arrived ordering his immediate transfer. He was to be reassigned to a depot in Cherbourg, a logistical backwater hundreds of miles from the front, where he would be in charge of counting crates of winter uniforms. He was being buried. His report was classified, his evidence was filed away, and the system, having identified and neutralized the threat, went back to its sacred, fatally flawed formulas. The Red Ball Express would continue to haul mountains of the wrong ammunition. The official explanation had been protected. The truth had been silenced. The transfer order was a death sentence for the truth. For Major O'Connell, it was the lowest point, a moment of crushing, absolute defeat. He packed his meager belongings in his tent, the reprimand sitting on his cot like a tombstone. He had screamed a warning into the storm, and the storm had simply blown it back in his face, leaving him isolated and discredited. He wasn't just being transferred, he was being erased. His name would become a cautionary tale for any other junior officer who dared to believe the evidence of his own eyes over the gospel of the daily briefing sheets. The system hadn't just ignored him. It had professionally, efficiently, and ruthlessly broken him. For the men of the Red Ball Express, the news filtered down the grapevine and was met with a grim, knowing cynicism. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, smelled the cordite, and heard the desperation in the tankers' voices. They knew O'Connell was right, and they knew, with the weary wisdom of the common soldier, that the brass would never listen. The transfer was just another confirmation of a fundamental law of the universe: the farther you were from the shooting, the less you understood the war. So they went back to work. They climbed into their cabs, fired up their engines, and continued to haul the tragically useless cargo they were given, their convoys now feeling less like a lifeline and more like a funeral procession. And for Patton's men on the Meuse, the price of this truth being buried was about to be paid in blood. O'Connell's transfer coincided with the very window of opportunity he had tried to warn them about. The Germans, masters of recovery, were not idle. While the staff officers at SHAF were busy shuffling papers and protecting their formulas, the Wehrmacht was rushing every available panzer unit to the front to slam the door that Patton had kicked open. The catastrophe, when it began, was not a single, dramatic event, but a series of brutal, grinding engagements along the Moselle River, just east of the Meuse. A place that would become infamous in the annals of the 4th Armored Division, the little French town of Héricourt. On the morning of September 18th, almost 3 weeks after O'Connell's warning was officially buried, the German counterattack came. It wasn't a probe or a feint. It was a full-throated assault by the 5th Panzer Army, spearheaded by brand-new Panther tanks, technologically superior in almost every way to the American Shermans. The battle for Héricourt began. Imagine you are a Sherman tank commander. You have been sitting in the same field for 2 weeks, husbanding a handful of armor-piercing rounds like they are crown jewels. Your crew is exhausted, living on cold rations. And then, out of the morning fog, the unthinkable appears: a wave of German tanks, their long 75mm cannons menacing, their thick sloped armor seemingly impervious. You give the order to fire. You watch your standard high-explosive shell, the only thing you have in abundance, splash uselessly off the Panther's glassy plate. You fire again. Another ricochet. The Panther doesn't even seem to notice. It continues to advance, its own gun traversing, searching. And you know, with a sickening certainty, that its first shot will not bounce off. That was the reality for Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division. The disaster O'Connell had predicted was now unfolding in real time. They were desperately outgunned. The tankers were forced to use tactics of sheer, suicidal courage, racing in close to the German behemoths, trying to get a shot at their thin side or rear armor. The radio nets crackled with frantic, desperate calls, not for reinforcements, but for ammunition. Jaguar, this is Wildcat 3. We're out of AP. Repeat, we are Winchester on armor-piercing rounds. All we have is he. The great spearhead of the 3rd Army was not just stalled, it was being hammered, its steel tip shattering against the German anvil. The momentum of August was a distant memory. The race across France was over. The war of exploitation had devolved into a desperate, slugging match for survival. And all because of a fatal assumption, a bureaucratic deafness, a truth that was spoken but not heard. The bill for the fog of war had come due, and it was being paid on the muddy fields of Héricourt. The Battle of Héricourt should have been a slaughter. It should have been the scene where the 4th Armored Division was wiped off the map, a textbook case of a technologically superior force annihilating a poorly supplied enemy. The German plan was sound. Their equipment was better. But war is never a simple equation of steel versus steel. It is a collision of realities, and the Germans, for all their tactical brilliance, had failed to account for 2 critical factors. The first was the sheer, bloody-minded courage and tactical genius of the American tankers, who refused to break. The second, and far more decisive factor, was the weather. Just as the German armor began its main push, the skies over Lorraine, which had been clear for days, broke open. A thick, soupy fog descended on the battlefield, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. It was a freak of nature, a meteorological anomaly that changed the entire dynamic of the fight. The German Panther's greatest advantage was its high-velocity cannon, which could kill a Sherman from over a mile away. In the fog of Héricourt, that advantage was completely neutralized. The battle was suddenly transformed from a long-range sniper duel into a series of point-blank, knife-fight ambushes in the mist. This is where the American tankers, forced by necessity to become masters of improvisation, turned the tables. They used the fog as a weapon. They would hold their fire, letting the sound of the approaching German engines grow louder and louder until a Panther loomed out of the gray wall, a monstrous silhouette. Only then, at near point-blank range, would the Shermans open up, their 75mm guns finally able to punch through the weaker side armor of the enemy tanks. It was terrifying, claustrophobic combat. It was a battle fought by ear as much as by sight, a deadly game of hide-and-seek in a gray abyss. While the tankers were fighting for their lives, a different kind of battle was being waged on the Red Ball Express. News of the German counterattack had finally, irrevocably, shattered the bureaucratic inertia at SHEF. The frantic calls for armor-piercing ammunition could no longer be dismissed as tactical hysteria. They were the screams of an army on the verge of annihilation. The effect was electric. O'Connell's buried memo was suddenly resurrected, now treated not as an annoyance, but as prophecy. The order that finally went out was one of supreme, unprecedented priority. It was simple: stop everything. Every truck on the Red Ball Express, regardless of its current cargo, was to be stripped. The mountains of rifle ammunition, the crates of K-rations, the barrels of motor oil, it was all to be dumped by the side of the road, left where it lay. The only cargo that mattered now was 75mm and 76mm AP shells. Every depot in Normandy was scoured. Ammunition intended for other armies was diverted. A frantic, theater-wide scavenger hunt began for the one thing that could save the 4th Armored Division. The Red Ball drivers, who had known the truth for weeks, received the new orders with a grim sense of vindication. They watched as their trucks were loaded with the long, slender, life-saving projectiles. The red ball on their bumpers suddenly had a new, more profound meaning. They drove with a fury they hadn't felt since the first days of the Express. They raced through the night, their headlights cutting tunnels in the rain and fog, knowing that every minute they saved could mean another Sherman crew survived the night. They weren't just hauling ammunition anymore. They were delivering vengeance. They were carrying the one thing that could turn the tide, the physical manifestation of a truth that had been ignored for far too long. The Red Ball Express had become a lifeline of pure lethality, racing to answer the desperate prayers coming from the fog-shrouded fields of Aricourt. Years later, long after the thunder of the guns had faded and the fields of Aricourt were green again, the official histories of the battle were written. They were clean, concise, and focused on the grand sweep of tactics. They spoke of the brilliant American use of terrain and fog, of the shocking kill ratios, of how a technologically inferior force had won one of the largest and most lopsided tank battles on the Western Front. The story of the Red Ball Express, if it was mentioned at all, was a footnote, a quaint tale of logistical grit. The near-catastrophic ammunition failure, the frantic scramble, Major O'Connell's buried report, all of it was swallowed by the archives, smoothed over by the clean narrative of victory. The fog of war, it seemed, had been replaced by the fog of history. But the truth, in wartime, is rarely found in the official communiques. It lives in the quiet, dusty files marked classified, waiting for time to turn the lock. In the late 1970s, a young, tenacious historian was granted access to the declassified logistics records of the European theater of operations. He wasn't looking for stories of heroism. He was an academic, a man of numbers, studying supply chain efficiency. Buried deep within a mountain of shipping manifests and tonnage reports, he found a folder labeled Aricourt Ammunition Urgent Action. Inside was the entire, sordid story. There was Major O'Connell's original, impassioned memo, with its chillingly accurate predictions. There were the curt, dismissive replies from high command. There was the official reprimand and the transfer order, stark and bureaucratic. And then, there was the flood of frantic, panicked messages from the front, culminating in the theater-wide order to dump all other cargo and ship only armor-piercing rounds. The historian laid the documents out on his table in chronological order. What he saw was not a story of logistics. It was a perfect, tragic drama in 3 acts. A warning given, a warning ignored, a catastrophe narrowly averted. The numbers in the manifests told the whole story. He could see the precise date the Red Ball's cargo shifted, almost overnight, from a mismanaged trickle of the right ammunition to a tidal wave. He could cross-reference that date with the after-action reports from Aricourt and see the exact moment the American tankers, who had been fighting with suicidal courage, suddenly found themselves with the tools they needed to win. He saw, in the cold, hard data, the vindication of one man's courage and the near-fatal cost of a system's arrogance. The final piece of the puzzle came from an oral history project, an interview with a retired colonel who had been a young captain in the 4th Armored Division. The old man, his voice raspy with age, recalled the moment the Red Ball trucks finally broke through. We were down to our last few rounds of AP, he remembered. We could hear their engines, getting ready for another push. We thought we were done for. And then we heard this rumbling from the rear. Not tanks. Different. It was trucks. A whole damn convoy of them, appearing out of the mist like ghosts, their bumpers painted with these big red dots. They didn't even stop at the supply point. They drove right onto the battlefield, right up to our positions, kicking open the tailgates. The drivers, hell, they were just kids, most of them colored boys. They were throwing crates of 76mm shells down at us, screaming, "Give him hell, boys. We brought you presents from the good folks back home." The colonel paused, his eyes distant. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It was like watching the cavalry arrive. We didn't just get ammunition that day. We got hope, and it was delivered by men our army had never truly trusted to fight. That day, they saved us all. So what is the declassified truth of the Red Ball Express? It's not just a story about trucks. It's a story about two kinds of knowledge locked in a desperate battle for the soul of an army. On one side, you have system knowledge. This is the knowledge of the map room, of the spreadsheet, of the carefully calculated formula. It's clean, logical, and powerful. It can plan invasions and move millions of men across oceans. But it is dangerously brittle. It operates on the fatal assumption that war will follow the rules. On the other side, you have ground knowledge. This is the knowledge of the dusty driver who sees the fear in a tanker's eyes. It's the wisdom of the mechanic who can build a working truck out of 3 broken ones. It's the desperate, whispered truth of the soldier at the tip of the spear. It is messy, chaotic, anecdotal, and often insubordinate. But it is real. It is the truth forged in the crucible of combat. The investigation into the Red Ball Express reveals that victory in war is often decided by which of these two kinds of knowledge prevails. For 3 critical weeks in the autumn of 1944, system knowledge was winning. The formulas were sacred, the manifests were unquestioned, and the entire Allied advance was grinding to a halt because the truth was being ignored. The near disaster at Aricourt was the brutal, bloody collision of the plan on paper with the reality of a Panther tank appearing out of the fog. The triumph of the Red Ball Express, its ultimate, declassified secret, is that for one brief, shining moment, ground knowledge won. The frantic warnings from the front, amplified by the drivers on the express and championed by a few brave officers, finally became so loud and so undeniable that they shattered the serene arrogance of the system. The entire weight of the Allied logistical machine was forced to pivot in a matter of hours, based not on a pre-approved plan, but on the desperate, chaotic truth of the battlefield. The echoes of this story are profound. They remind us that the most critical intelligence in any conflict is often not the decoded enemy signal, but the unfiltered report from your own front line. The true villain, the fog of war, is not just the confusion caused by the enemy, it is the deafness of a command structure that has fallen in love with its own plan. The Red Ball Express, manned by forgotten men driving borrowed trucks on broken roads, became more than a supply line. It became the nervous system of the Allied army, a conduit of truth that ultimately saved Patton's reputation, his army, and the momentum of the entire war. And it stands today as a timeless, brutal lesson. An army that does not trust the knowledge of its own soldiers is an army that is already defeated.